Welcome to the Allo Capital podcast. If you're just joining us, we are summoning Allo Capital, a new spinout from Gitcoin that is designed to build the capital allocation layer of the next internet. I think there's big upside here. Capital allocation is a multi-trillion-dollar design space. VCs, governments, NGOs, and DAOs all have to allocate capital to survive and thrive. But it is also a place where we can start small. Every time you spend money, you are allocating capital. We are threading a through line, partnering with builders, researchers, and funders to figure out what post-AI, post-on-chain capital allocation look like is built and building it on-chain. If you want to learn more, visit our website at allo.capital, where you can download the books for free, play with some of our dApps, join the Telegram, or participate in the DAO. My guest today is Dr. Christopher Vitale, Associate Professor of Media Studies at Pratt Institute and author of Networkologies, A Philosophy of Networks, and the forthcoming book, Artificial Intelligence, A Warning, Science, Philosophy, and Society. Chris's book, Networkologies, lives rent-free in my brain, and I think he's one of the sharpest thinkers when it comes to networks and what the new internet is going to look like. I think he brings a rare interdisciplinary perspective to AI, bridging neuroscience, philosophy, complex systems, and cultural critique to challenge the tech industry's default assumptions about intelligence and progress. In this conversation, we explore what makes human thinking truly distinct, the risks posed by AI development trajectories, and what alternative models for innovation and capital allocation look like. You can read Chris's book on his website, networkologies.wordpress.com. There's also a link in the show notes if you want to check it out. I think you are going to enjoy this episode with Christopher. Hey, Christopher, how's it going?
Hey, good to see you.
Good to see you again. Your episode that we did together about 2 years ago on Networkologies lives rent-free in my head. So we'll have a link to that in the show notes for listeners to check out Networkologies. But yeah, where I'd like to play jazz is, maybe you could tell us a little bit more about your most recent work. What have you been doing since Networkologies? And then we can kind of explore that combinatorial design space of building abundance networks in the 21st century. So I'll just dangle that it sounds like you've got a new book that you're working on, and it's very AI centric. So take us down the most recent work.
Yeah, no, this book is called Artificial Intelligence, A Warning, Science, Philosophy, and Society. And basically, I started writing it when I saw two major developments happen in AI research that scared the crap out of me, just to be, frank about this. I had looked at it, and every time I heard people say, oh, AGI is coming, artificial general intelligence, or ASI, artificial superintelligence, or self-improving intelligence, whichever terms one uses. Whenever people said that those are coming, I'm just like, well, I know the tech and there's no path. There's no pathway there. So if they say that the robots are going to kill us all, and this is a species level risk, I've been keeping up on the research. There's not a path there. And then I saw the path open. And that was a moment where just everything switched. And I went from a skeptic of the idea that AI could be a species level risk, an existential risk, to a believer in one evening after I saw news of two developments. And those two developments were the absolute zero paradigm in machine learning, which was a paper that was published. And then NVIDIA's director of AI, Jim Fan, showed a way that he, has been working to get around what he calls the physical Turing test. And then I wrote this book, because I felt we need a warning.
Mm-hmm. So let's unpack a little bit here. Can you take us into how you got into this idea that AI and AGI could be a species level extinction risk? It sounds like there's two things there. NVIDIA was one of the branch of the thinking, and then also this not 0 day, it's zero.
Absolute zero. Yeah.
Absolute zero. Okay, cool. Let's unpack each of those.
Sure. The absolute zero paradigm, it's a paper that was published by a group of researchers, and it showed how using self-play, which is what was done with AlphaGo, right? The AlphaGo was the program that was used to play itself, essentially.
In Go.
Yes, in Go. I'm sorry, AlphaZero was used to play Go. Yeah.
Okay.
So they created an algorithm that was playing against itself in the Go environment, and it learned from doing that. And they took that paradigm and they applied it to reasoning in a more general sense. They said, well, can we get a system to teach itself how to reason? And so it split up into a teacher and a student, and they would, basically work on each other. The teacher would learn something from the environment and then grade its difficulty and then create a sequence of learning tasks for the learner, who would then internalize those learning tasks sequentially and move through the stages of deduction, induction, and abduction, which for logicians are the three major, forms of rational thinking. Now, they're doing this in the computer science sense of this thing. So it's, there are reasons to think it is not exactly the same. Strong reasons to think it's not the same as what humans do.
So it feels like it's exploring the design space of possible permutations of strategies in Go, and then learning through self-play. They
did that in Go a couple of years ago, but now they're doing it with learning programming languages. And so it goes into a programming environment like, the Python environment, right? And then it learns how to program sequentially.
So what's surprising to that about me is that like Go is a very like bounded rules-based environment. Whereas this seems like learning programming feels like intelligence in an open-ended real world scenario. Like maybe programming is bounded in some ways, but it's not bounded in the same way that Go is, where you can quantify each like board state, unless there's some bridge there that I'm missing.
No, well, the goal here is to develop a way for a system to go into any structured environment and teach itself how to do deduction, induction, and abduction, which is analogical reasoning. Induction is scientific pattern extraction. Deduction is logical reasoning. You learn those three skills, you have the basics of reasoning, if you want to think this through, at least in that sort of way. And the goal of this system was that it could do self-training AI, self-improving AI with zero human data. That is a game changer, because we kept hearing the big bottleneck for training the next level of AI is they need more data.
Yeah, I think it's pretty incredible when you boil it down to that. But I think the NVIDIA branch of this is going to really blow our minds. So tell us how NVIDIA adds to and accelerates the absolute zero progression.
So the first thing is we have self-improving AI that requires zero human data. Game changer. That is the self-improving AI that people have been talking about forever. And it is designed to work within any structured environment. They tested it on Python code, but it was able to do better at math problems after it had done this training, right? Regular math problems. Okay, so what's going on in NVIDIA is Jim Fan will say that he has found a way to pass the physical Turing test, right? He's the director of AI at NVIDIA. And his argument is that we've already got chatbots that pass the regular Turing test. They can fool us into thinking that there's another human on the other end of the chat, right? And that's the famous Turing test. The physical Turing test is, can it walk? Can a robot walk and operate in the world in a way like a human would? And so far, for robots, the answer is absolutely not. And the big problem is they need data to train the neural networks. And how do you get enough data when you don't have enough robots? Right? You need sensors on all of their arms and all of their extensions. And so it's just a very time-consuming, labor-consuming process. And Jim Fan is like, well, why do we need actual robots? Why don't we use simulated robots in simulated virtual worlds? And they're already doing this at NVIDIA. So he shows these videos of thousands of different robots training in slightly different thousands of environments, right? So you have legions of simulated robots, and they're in slightly different environments. And the neural networks that are trained there can then be downloaded into physical robots. Once you get that, robotics, it's just a matter of building the physical robots. Once you really get to where you can train the neural networks, robotics is going to go through the stratosphere. And so we have two major developments that are likely to change. First, we have self-improving AI. And then we have such a revolution in robotics that is likely around the horizon where that AI can become embodied. These are game changers.
So it feels like if I'm picking up, I'm going to reduce this a little bit to summarize for the audience, but it feels like there's the physical train how they'll respond to the environment. And we can do it on the order of 1,000x faster in simulated physical environments than we can in the actual physical world. And so you've basically, when I assemble all of these ideas together, we've got absolute zero, which means that robots can do reasoning induction, deduction, abductive reasoning with zero human data, and they can now with NVIDIA do it 10,000 times faster than humans can, then this is basically what broke your brain and made you think, oh my God, we're going to hit AGI and it's a huge risk. Am I playing that back correctly?
Yeah, basically. I mean, I would say the absolute zero paradigm, that is in regard to the, what's in a standard computer, right? That's the software side of things.
Yeah.
And the hardware side of things is the robotics. And you put those together, and both of those are game changer situations separately. You put them together, oh my goodness. So I think what they call HEI will come about from the first development, but the impact on the world for robotics with the second development is monumental as well.
Yeah. So if I play this forward 20 years, we basically got humanoid robots walking around the street, and you can't tell who's a robot and who's an actual human, like actual Westworld stuff.
I mean, look, they're still going to look like robots unless we get synthetic biology.
Mm-hmm.
But aside from, look, how long will it take them to scale to actual physical robots? Who knows? And will they be humanoid or will they be task specific? We don't know.
Right.
And will it actually be AGI? Well, it'll be self-improving AI. Absolutely. Whether it'll be general intelligence depends on how you define that. And a lot of the book explores, how are these companies defining intelligence? And why does that matter? And what are they going to call AGI? And how is it going to be different from what humans do? And why does that matter?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that this sort of brings me to questions about human intelligence and what makes it distinct from robot intelligence. So if we play that forward, what do you think the differences are, and how do they play forward into how society is organized and like ideally organized in your mind?
I mean, if you look at OpenAI, according to their stated definition of what an artificial general intelligence would be, they define intelligence as anything that is able to do economically valuable work. That is an enormously reductive definition of intelligence. If you look at how a lot of computer scientists are talking about intelligence, it's achieving tasks. Okay, a little bit better, until you think about the fact that humans often don't know what task they're trying to achieve until afterwards. They discover it along the way. And there's often a process of not only having open-ended goals, but of reframing what you're trying to accomplish as you're going. That sort of deep evolutionary, constant transformation of yourself and the task and the process, that's something that humans do at peak creativity. Mm-hmm. And that's not something that you can fit into a paradigm that is, here's your task, can you achieve it? But this is what intelligence is being reduced to by a lot of the computer science models. And that's why I'm saying we need to look at how neuroscientists are talking about intelligence, how how philosophers, how evolutionary anthropologists are talking about the evolution of human intelligence and human brains, human groupings, and even animal intelligence and the evolution of life. We need a bigger frame rather than sort of a computer science approach to intelligence, which I think sells what humans and animals do short when they're thinking.
The mind blower for me here is this idea that intelligence is a hyperobject. And if you take the capitalist frame, it's about reducing it to economically valuable activity. If you take the computational frame, it's about just solving problems. And then, but if you take a little bit, a third frame of evolving and creativity being the measure of intelligence, like you're basically looking at this hyperobject of intelligence in many different ways. And it sort of matters what angle you take a look at it when you're figuring out how to answer these questions. How do we even talk about intelligence and what is valuable about our intelligence? Might be key questions as we're building abundance networks for this world.
Well, I mean, I'd like to shift the discourse, honestly, and I work on this in the book, from intelligence to thinking. What does it mean to think? And if you ask yourself, what is intelligence? That already is framing things in terms of IQ tests, which have been shown to be deeply problematic. I think the history of the notion of intelligence is a deeply disturbing history, and how that notion has been employed. If you look at thinking is deeply invested in issues of questioning. And when you question, like, why are we doing this? Right? When you step back from something you're doing and just like, do we really want this sort of world? Do we want where this is going? That's a deep existential sort of questioning, and it requires being embodied. It requires a value system that is multi-scaled in living organisms in a way that computers don't have. Computers don't have multi-level feedback in relationship to a body with drives and desires and needs. And so one of the things I talk about in this book is that according to neuroscientists, or at least a lot of contemporary neuroscientists, what we call rational human thinking is not recognizably human if you take value out of the equation. Because if you ask a computer, does it matter if you live or die? Well, the computer doesn't even know what these concepts mean other than what it learned from its training data. But if you ask a human, does it matter if you live or die? Oh my God, right? The sense of consequence and the sense of value, the sense of why consequences matter and why you'd prefer one over another, those are tied to our value systems. And those value systems are related to the emotional and affective systems that link brain and body. And computer science cuts that out. It looks only at, the notion of a computer as a disembodied brain. And I think we need to start thinking of brains as aspects of bodies again. And that's where neuroscience is going.
Mm-hmm. So play us forward, 10, 20, 30 years. How do you see all this playing out? I know that's a wide question, but...
Ooh, yeah. I worry about mass unemployment. That's my big, right? I've got a chapter in the book where I talk about worst case scenarios, and I go through all the killer robot scenarios and all the arguments that have been given, for why we are likely to end up with killer robots and why we are unlikely to be able to control them. And unfortunately, I find some of the, if you want to read like a real sort of Dr. Strangelove type book, check out Nick Bostrom's Superintelligence. This is the book about basically, it works on an assumption. Let's assume that there's superintelligence. What then? And then it just plays it out. And it's like, well, humans are super intelligent in regard to ants. How do we treat ants? We are super intelligent in regard to horses. When horses were no longer useful, how did we deal with horses? Will we become like pets? Will we become like ants who, look, we don't intend to kill ants, but if we're going to do a construction project and we have to kill ants, it's just something humans do. And so the arguments are very methodical. And it's like, even if the AI means us no harm, if it's super intelligent, we are in trouble. And they talk about all the scenarios. They talk about trying to limit the powers of the artificial intelligence, trying to make it narrow, trying to make it an oracle so it only gives yes or no answers to questions. And they list every single scenario for how that could be undermined. And there is no good AI safety that I find convincing. And unfortunately, I find a lot of Bostrom's arguments to be convincing. If it is super intelligent, then there's no way to control it. And so I go through all of those worst case scenarios. But then I'm just like, look, even if none of that happens, we're going to have mass unemployment. And I think self-driving cars is the tipping point. When we get self-driving cars, if the rollout is fast, huge portions of the workforce are going to be put out of work very quickly. And if you look historically at what happens when there's mass unemployment, it creates the conditions for fascism. That's just historically what has happened. And that is really, really concerning. Now, granted, the Russian Revolution had it, but those were different conditions. That was not a condition of mass unemployment. There were many problems with the Tsarist Empire, but mass unemployment was not one of them.
Mm-hmm.
So if you look historically, yeah.
So I mean, it's you're so well researched and thoughtful, and thank you for sort of like laying out a spread of places we could go next. The one that I want to start with, I guess, is the mass unemployment one, and it feels like the mantra here has been UBI is the counter to that. In the most constructive sort of form, this argument is, well, if we give people a basic income, then they'll be released to do leisure activities or to pursue work. And not have to worry about their sustenance, and so there will be no reason to riot. And also, we're giving people the opportunity to thrive. But it seems like there's a lot of economic questions, like where does the money for the UBI come from? Are we just printing currency, or is there some sort of productive asset? And then the people I talk to about this say, well, we should just take the AI's economic output and give a portion to some sort of universal basic income or capital or something like that, which feels like, hopefully our AI techno gods will give us a couple drops of that growth. But like, are we talking about AI UBI DAOs here, or is there another design space that excites you?
I mean, look, if we are able to get universal basic income, yes, I think that solves a lot of the problems. I just don't think, look, I think mass unemployment is coming if we stay on the current trajectory. And the only way I can think of to avoid that is something like UBI. Unless governments start planning now for mass automation, and not just of drivers, but of mid-level workers. It's going to be much sooner than we think that any task that can be done on a computer will be performable by AI. And that means lawyers are going to be out of a job in droves. We tend to think of lawyers as lawyers don't go to court much. Mostly, they read and write very specific types of texts. They write contracts. They negotiate settlements, right? So if lawyers are all out of work, then we're going to see people clamoring for change who actually have some social power. And so UBI, hopefully there is something of that sort. And if not, I can't see where things resolve.
One of the influences on me has been Radical Exchange and Glenn Weil. And they publish a magazine now called Combinations, which recently had an article entitled "The Three Types of Post-Capitalist Income." And basically it said in an AI-centric world, the types of income opportunities for humans will be built around capital ownership, so owning assets, personality cults.
It's a very peculiar set of, like, why those? Why those three?
I think that basically, like, if intelligence is commodified and AI is everywhere, then that's sort of like a rising tide, and the places where people are still afloat is when they can monetize their relationships or their cult of personality, their curational capacity on social media, and then also their capital ownership. Like, I think the idea is that in a world in which everyone's looking for an edge, those are the things that the AIs will consume last, or at least not immediately, is relational personality cults and capital ownership.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think we need to do everything we can to slow down the pace of AI development.
Okay.
Because I think we need to have various new social structures in place to help us prepare for all of the changes that are coming with massive automation. So if, it's true that those are, probably three things that will be some of the last to be, sort of eaten by AI automation. But I think, we do need to slow down, and it needs to be global, because if China versus the US are, like, we have this sort of self-reinforcing logic of what if they get there first? No, what if they get there first? Well, if people are working together and they start treating AI like you treat nuclear proliferation, because you see it as a real danger, and then you try to slow it down, because it is probably inevitable. You try to slow it down long enough so that you can build enough safety structures, including social safety structures, things like UBI, to get us ready so that the impact is not as destabilizing. This is what some people talk about as, like, a fast takeoff versus a slow takeoff. We want a slow takeoff. A fast takeoff could be devastating.
So the rate of change matters. I'm wondering what types of structures should be built in this new world, or this accelerating new world. And to me, I mean, for me, I'll just share that I'm feeling increased urgency around abundance networks. How do we build networks that distribute the abundance, either from the AI or any other sort of economic activity, any surplus to the edges, and routing around intermediaries that could capture them, routing around fascists. So to me, it feels like different flavors of abundance networks. But what does that picture look like to you?
Yeah, I mean, there's one book that really has influenced my thinking on this, and that's Rutger Bregman's work, Humankind: A Hopeful History. And he looks at the arguments, say, for UBI and why it is fundable, and places where it's been made to work, the problems that have gone along with it, and things that have been done to solve that. So I do think abundance networks are possible. I think we have capture agents. these intermediaries, as you speak of them, we have, you look at shareholder capitalism, it is not in the public good. It is there to make money for prior investors. And even if you have a company that wants to do good, it will be sued by its own shareholders. I don't think a lot of people know that if a company tries to do good rather than make profit, that there's a Supreme Court case in the US from 1919 related to Ford Motor Company. And the shareholders can sue their own board, and make it so that they put profit before everything else. So we need to change some of these structural systems that make it so that profit is the only thing that can matter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, I mean, it feels like to me, if I were to paint the 2x2 matrix here of if one axis is like, is it for the public good or for the private good? And then the other axis is it effective or is it responsive to market conditions or not? It feels like in one quadrant, we've got governments, which are for the public good, but an argument against them is that they're inefficient and hard to reform. And the other is companies, which are more effective in that they're subject to shareholder capitalism, which is sort of like an evolutionary environment that evolves the most profitable companies. Like, is there a way to blend that 2x2 matrix such that we are evolving responsive public goods entities that are not subject to the capture or bureaucracy that we've seen in more statist attempts to solve for the public goods? And to me, that's where networks come in.
Well, I would say the stuff that you're trying to investigate with Allo Capital, with quadratic funding, using blockchain to come up with new forms of social organization where values and money and democracy come together. If you look at, the history of states throughout history, they are related to the monopoly on violence, right? In terms of the king is the one who controls the army, and the one who controls the violence is the one who gets to become the king, historically speaking. Priests were there always to legitimate, the king, essentially. If you look at the function of police, historically speaking, it's to protect property, or in the United States and many other places, it was to capture slaves, runaway slaves. So I think the problem with states is that they defend territorial interests, and those interests are often related to property. If we find ways around traditional states and their monopoly on currency as we know it, right? Because so much of the power that the United States has around the world is the fact that it has the global reserve currency. That global reserve currency is what allows it to export inflation around the globe. It is what allows it to basically manipulate markets, internationally speaking. And the reason why it maintains its grip on that is because its military gives it access to oil, which is largely what backs the currency after the gold standard, after we went off the gold standard. I realize this is a little bit in the weeds in certain ways. But I think the possibility of DAOs to go around these things and to create new sorts of international actors that can do things like develop alternate currencies that can get around the global reserve currency and the current systems that are locked into place and supported by traditional networks of violence. What concerns me, though, is if these traditional networks of violence now have incredible drone armies that are powered by artificial intelligence. And I fear that that's coming. We already see drone warfare in Ukraine, and we're very close already to having those drones, which are already hunting humans, being AI powered without a human in the loop. We're this close to it. And that is terrifying.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think the trend line in Ukraine of drone warfare is not positive when you add in AI, especially. Yeah, it feels like a dystopia in which it's all about, there's violence possible from anywhere without accountability at all times. And, I guess there's this philosophy, just to zoom out a little bit. Vitalik has this philosophy called DIAC, which is meant to sort of be if EAC is about effective accelerationists, air quotes effective, and then like the polar opposite of that is decelerating technological change. There's a big swath in the Ethereum community and around Vitalik that wants to accelerate defensive technology, democratic technology, and so that's where the idea of DIAC comes from. It's about, if we're on an exponential curve, if we just accelerate the defensive technologies way more than we're accelerating the offensive technologies, then that's a way to sort of avoid the worst dystopias. I'm wondering if anyone's out there listening that's a DIAC fan, hopefully I did it justice. But I'm wondering if you could respond to the sort of like DIAC thesis there that a lot of people in the Ethereum ecosystem believe in.
Well, what would be a defensive technology that could not be quickly converted to an offensive?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the rub, is that when you're doing basic R&D, you don't really know whether something could be used offensively or defensively. And so I think that to me, that's the rub, is the classification scheme.
I mean, you look at LLMs, for example, right? You know, the technology behind chatbots and things like that. The military is deeply invested in that because the attention capacities that make these things work, whereby the algorithms use attention to determine which words in a sentence to parse first, are incredibly useful for targeting. When you have to determine which of the, projectiles coming towards me do I target first? Which objective do I target first? So I think it's very hard to say which things will or will not be used by the military in various ways. I think there's all sorts of, the military is one of the largest funders of AI research. Historically, it was the domino, right? If you look, and that has largely gone through, it's largely, done through other types of allocation networks these days, but the government is still deeply invested.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thanks for that critique. I think that I'll share that in Ethereum. If I come up with a better answer, then maybe I'll send you an email after this episode and we can continue the discussion. But so play us forward in your research and your thinking on this design space. If I'm a builder working on Ethereum and AI and crypto, what do I focus on? I guess is the way that I'm coming at it, but I'm curious to have you play forward your research and we can kind of play jazz on top of those two design spaces.
I think the real potential of DAOs is to become what labor unions were supposed to be in some sense. We could have unions of just about any, just like we have a freelancers union, right? Which was kind of a new development, the idea of how could all freelancers get together? Well, today we could have unions of just about anything. And you don't have to call them a union, but they could be organizations of people who care about something collectively and that expresses their values and that they develop collective governance and, create. You look at Wikipedia, for example, that is a completely democratically controlled space of volunteers. And it has made encyclopedia production a capital-free space. You can't make money selling encyclopedias anymore, which used to be a huge industry.
Yeah, it's kind of commoned it. It's made money by commoning knowledge, which is incredible.
I think that's Paul Mason's idea, that Wikipedia is a model in some sense of what could be done to increase commoning over profit.
That's great. In the Abundance Networks book, we actually lead with the example of Wikipedia. So I feel like we've fallen off backwards into the same example.
Wikipedia is an incredible example. Yeah.
I think that, to me, the exciting thing in the design space is finding new forms in which people can bottoms up create solidarity with each other. The union term, I think, is one that's well known, but it's also loaded with a lot of politics and baggage from the 20th century. But then we've got this bottoms up peer-to-peer coordination and mutualism and solidarity, that sort of word space. The people that I know that are working in that space, I think, are among the most hopeful in Web3 that I work on. But this problem for me is that sometimes they don't ship and they don't ship good enough software. And now is the time when we need to be scaling these fucking things, not just like circle jerking and researching about how it's going to happen soon. Like we need the action agents in these communities. And so, what are the first things that you'd love to see built or scaled within this design space?
If you could finally start having DAOs with smart contracts that can, actually build in a distributed way and work on projects in ways that do not require so much of the traditional top-down infrastructure, then you could start coming up with really distributed agents that can actually start exerting influence even in the design spaces where artificial intelligence is being created. And I think if it's the top-down agencies that get there first, there's a lot of danger,
Yeah. I think that where we're at now with DAOs is the technology does work. It takes definitely a subspecies, like a niche of nerds that are actually really doing DAO technology. And there's maybe thousands of us. But the thing that I'm seeing is that over the last 4 years, we've seen a huge systematic bear market in DAOs. And there were DAOs that could just run on vibes in 2021 and have $1 billion market cap. And now the bottom has fallen out on all of that, and everyone's playing the capitalist game of get revenue or downsize. And it's been really, I think it's been sort of like a capitalist realism check that these things need inflows into them, and maybe not without reason. I think that to me, if something in nature doesn't have energy flowing into it, then it's not going to survive, or at least it's harder to survive for longer. And it feels like it's the same thing with DAOs or any other sort of like contemporary structure in the modern economy. It needs to have a flow of energy or of revenue or of life or something like that. And so I think that that's kind of where we're at with DAOs. The tech does work, but it's at a small scale, and we haven't found sort of venture scale DAOs or like big enough DAOs that it's worth the masses time. Like everyone's mostly pivoted to AI when they're chasing the new hot trend, but there is a cosmic background radiation of progress in DAOs, and I think that makes me hopeful.
I guess I'm worried that if the social media is still being algorithmically curated by profit-centered systems, then people's horizons are deeply limited. And there's this saying within behavioral, studies of social media that if it's free, you are the product. And we are the product of social media. When it comes to AI, we are not the consumer, right? It's being sold to us as, oh, this will make our lives easier, but it's being made for industry and government. It's being made for the funders. And that's not us. We're the beta testers. And so I think unless the media environment changes, people's sense of what is possible will be constrained, largely speaking. And there'll always be people who question, always people on the margins, but the large majority of people will unfortunately be captured by these ecosystems.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I can definitely see how the attention economy creates a focus on short-term dopamine hits and sort of playing the same game. There's a self-reinforcing systemic structure that channels attention and energy towards propagating the same system. I also see people who are living in parallel societies in which they're playing the game of the old system and they're playing the game of the new system and trying to build a bridge between them. And in some places, it's actually kind of interesting because being activated creatively and really engaging yourself and your peers here is a form of competitive advantage in the capitalist system, if depending on the type of work that you're doing. But shout out to the bridge builders who are working in that parallel society structure here.
Yeah, well, I mean, building the new society within the ruins of the old is, the classic anarchist, sort of statement. And I think it's what you got to do. You got to show that alternate models are possible. And in times of crisis, when the classical system is breaking down, which is what capitalism does, it's designed around, systems that go out of control, spiral into crisis, and then crash and recalibrate. If you look at the history of capitalism, from its very beginning, it was about speculation on tulips, then speculation on colonial enterprises. And so you have the South Sea bubble, you have the Mississippi Company bubble, you have the tulip bubble, one after the next. As soon as you introduce a stock market, the economy crashes or anything like it, right? And it's because speculation goes ahead of the productive economy, and then it falls. The bottom falls out, and then it starts again. So you have these cycles of speculation where you have more artificial or virtual currency than actual productive assets that are backing this. This might seem a reductive way to approach it, because I'm not saying the virtual currencies are not incredibly powerful. I'm just saying that they don't have anything to back them up. And then when people panic, that value that people think is there collapses. Historically speaking, this is what capitalism does. And so where does that leave us?
A couple reactions to that, I feel like I'm channeling the book Financial Revolutions and Technological Capital, which covers this idea of financial bubbles around technological revolutions, and how old they are and truly historic, whether you're talking about Bitcoin or sort of the South Sea bubble. But I guess like my second reaction to what you're saying is that there are some digital currencies that I think are backed, and in crypto right now, stablecoins are a big thing. So basically, the U.S. dollar is able to be exported to places like Argentina and Venezuela through stablecoins, and people in Argentina use it to escape their hyperinflating currency locally. And so I think that that's one form of backing. And then Bitcoin and Ethereum, people would say, oh, it's backed by math, but then that gets into sort of like monetary theory and what is real. Like I would agree with you that like the shit coins that are further out on the risk curve aren't backed by anything. But it feels like there's an awesome design space here if you have something that's it's epistemologically backed and able to be stable, to program our values into money and build better economies here. And maybe that's the hope of what we're trying to do with abundance networks and the solar punk parts of crypto.
I mean, some people have said, have commons backed currencies, so that, anyone who pollutes in the commons has to pay a tax. And that way the commons as the source of value creates income. And, like a river can be, something that backs a part of your currency, essentially, because anyone who pollutes in it has to pay a fine, and that fine generates income. And so you have there an actual, source of value that can back something that isn't gold and that isn't just merely fluctuating.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they used to back currency on land when farm productivity. So these schemes may sound out there, but they actually have been done. And so in times of crisis, when there's currency crises, they often shifted to land-based backing for the currency.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's an interesting design space. I'm almost imagining that governments of the future could be unbundled from one currency into like a currency for commons based things, a currency for trade, a currency for military. I don't know, like it's dystopian quick when you unbundle it. But those are all the services that have been bundled into your local, state, and national government.
I mean, governments are essentially like their source of income is always the future tax dollars. And when you think of it, like what really backs the US dollar, it's future tax income.
Mm-hmm.
And if you think of it that way, it's just like, well, anything can back a currency that can create income. Anything that's a source of value and that produces more value.
Right. Yeah, it's really fascinating design space. I feel so lucky to be studying this stuff and nerding out on it. And I think that open source economies are the, unless I was going to be in the Fed or something like that, like open source money is the only place that I think that I could like stumble upon this midway through my career. But, as we're starting to wrap up, I guess I'm wondering, what didn't I ask that you want to talk about? Yeah, it's really fascinating design space. I feel so lucky to be studying this stuff and nerding out on it. And I think that open source economies are the, unless I was going to be in the Fed or something like that, like open source money is the only place that I think that I could like stumble upon this midway through my career. But, as we're starting to, it's interesting that you mentioned McCarthyism and calling people commies in the 30s and the 50s, because there's actually been a resurgence of that in Ethereum, which you wouldn't know unless you were following Ethereum drama. But basically, when the number goes down, when prices go down, people get cranky, and there was an outburst of people calling progressive crypto people commies. So I don't know, I'd be curious like how you would react to, are DAOs communist or co-ops communist? Are we inventing a more networked form of peer-to-peer organization, or like traditional statist communism? It doesn't feel like that's really what you're proposing to me, but I'm gonna guess, how would you respond to a neo-networked McCarthyism?
Good Lord. I mean, look, what Stalin and Lenin did was not communism. And, even what Marx was proposing, he calls it communism. But there's, some people have said like the idea of capture of state power, dictatorship of the proletariat. These are top-down ideologies. And so, communism, however you look at the history of it, there's a lot to be inspired by, but obviously it's led to some of the worst horrors of the century. And so, I think the thing that I liked about cooperatives was that it was small scale. And then the question becomes, how do you scale beyond that? And this is where I think, things like quadratic funding, I think there are technological possibilities for scaling that didn't exist before. Now, some people have said that cooperatives, the big issue for them is ultimately funding, is that they're not profitable to compete in the large scale with capitalist organizations. And there is some truth to that, but I think the issue is, what is the larger frame? If the larger regulatory governmental frame is foreground in shareholder capitalism, then you're going to find that it creates structures that bolster that. I mean, we subsidize our mega corporations enormously. If we subsidize things that were in the public good because the public has shown that they want that through various forms of real bottom-up democratic governance that gets around the campaign finance system and the media empires and all the ways in which monopoly capital ties that up, we could have.
As we're starting to wrap up, I guess I'm wondering, what didn't I ask that you want to talk about? And certainly knowing my audience is builders and people are excited about abundance networks and capital allocation, like, what would you leave us with?
I mean, look, I don't think AI is necessarily evil. I'm fascinated by neural networks. I think they're absolutely brilliant in a certain sense. But I think if you build these systems in our current governmental and economic set of circumstances, we are asking for disaster because of all the potentials for runaway systems that get out of control very quickly. And the simplest is mass unemployment. Right? Unless we start doing things now, I don't think we're going to be ready for what happens in 10 years from now. Or like the career of software engineer, it is gone. Just the way, checkout clerks at, grocery stores, small mom and pop places, it's still left, but any big, supermarket chain, it's gone. Well, now software designer is gone. And so which careers are going to be gone in 10 years? When they hit self-driving cars, then we're going to, that's such a big chunk of the economy. And so I think we need to start organizing now. And I think distributed networks that get around the traditional forms of organization, we talk about labor unions, they have long been co-opted by the system. There's no question of that. So we need new forms of organization that are ground up.
If you think that what we're riding is an exponential curve of, let's just target back to absolute zero and NVIDIA, basically like infinitely exponentially learning systems that can learn a million times X more than humans. Like, is there a way to set off to fight fire with fire and build an exponential curve that unfolds in the way that you envision the world happen? I guess like maybe a more practical way of asking this is like, could you put like the UBI DAO on an exponential curve, like invent an AI that's gonna invent something like that, fight fire with fire? Is that sort of like a naive way of approaching the design space?
Well, you look at someone like Ray Kurzweil. Who I've got a lot of issues with, but he's director of, I believe, engineering at Google, and he argues that humanity has always surpassed itself. That's kind of what humanity does. And so once we develop strong enough AI, we should merge with it, right? That's the next step of humanity sort of exceeding its own limitations. On some level, that's terrifying, but we are going to end up in inevitably post-human futures, where through genetic engineering, through, whole brain emulation, right? Which, people are researching. It's much further, out there, timeline wise than AI. But, eventually we're going to get to the point where we can scan people's brains and do something useful with that. We're already getting to the point where they can literally reconstruct what people are thinking, right? They can use people's thought patterns. There are books that have looked at the recent developments where they can read people's thought patterns and use them not only to move cursors on the screen, but even reconstruct the song they're thinking about in their head and things like that. Massive concerns with privacy. So as technology develops, we are going to end up in a post-human future. And the question is it going to be based on values that we all agree on, that are negotiated in common, or are they going to be based on runaway systems, which may be only accountable to a select few that have captured the value system? And I think we need new structures in place before some of this technology goes exponential.
Got it. So it feels like there's a little bit of like, if my question is like, can we build an exponential and ride that? I think the answer that I'm hearing from you, and this is reductive of what you said, is sort of like, yes, by merging with the AI, or like, depending on it in a new way, creating some sort of symbiosis, then we ride that wave also. But that's the best case scenario.
Okay. Maybe. Okay.
I'll backtrack on that a little bit because it sounds like it. Yeah.
Well, I don't think the idea of merging with AI sounds absolutely terrifying.
Right. Okay.
Because we don't know what we lose in the process. But I think we are headed towards post-human futures, maybe in the far distant, right? Depending on where we're going. The very definition of the human is going to be renegotiated. And some would say, look, that's what humans have been doing from the start. As soon as language showed up on the scene, as soon as images and tools, humans have been modifying what it means to be their own species.
Right.
Okay, got it. But I think what we need is systems for development that are not prioritizing mere profit and control for a few. And the future that is created will be determined by the social technologies that give rise to the physical technologies. And right now, those social technologies that are creating the environment that's evolving tech is deeply concerning. That's current governments and, capitalist, hyper-capitalism, techno-feudalism, whatever you want to call this. And so I think unless we deal with those underlying issues, whatever.
Well, I'd love to end on a hopeful question. So let me lob this one over to you. In a world in which you're maximally successful, what does the world look like in 10 or 20 years out?
Where I'm maximally successful, right? Like
in implementing this vision, yeah.
Oh, in implementing a vision. I mean, I don't think any individual should get to implement their vision, to be honest. I think we need bottom-up democracy, which is what the stuff you're doing is about. It's bottom-up distributed forms of organization where everybody gets to participate in asking the question, what would be a better world for us all? Right? Not what's going to make the most profit for the next quarter, but in the long term, what sort of world do we want to create for us and our children and future generations? If we're collectively asking those questions in a way that isn't, one person gets astronomically more say than someone else, I think then we're on a good track. But we are nowhere near that because today it's dollars that have the votes, not individuals.
Mm-hmm. So a more directed form of evolution that's oriented around what kind of world we want to live in, we collectively, the democratic body politic, as opposed to the sort of like capitalist, cancerous, exponential growth mindset would be the way I would reduce that down.
Sure. I mean, today, if you have $1 million and another person has one, they have 1 million times more say in many domains of the world today. Mm-hmm. That's not the way it should be.
So that's what Vitalik would call plutocracy. Basically, like the more monies, the more votes you have, the more monies. Okay. Well, this conversation has had my head swirling, and you're one of my favorite sort of inspirations for getting really amped up on all of these different trends and creating a synthesis of. So we'll have a link to that in the show notes for listeners to check out Networkologies. But could you revisit what the core ideas were there?
Yeah, the basic idea is that networks are the paradigm of the present and the future. I think that's almost a truism at this point, but there has yet to be a philosophy of networks. The very idea might seem crazy to some people, but that was what I sought to do is, ask the question of if we're going to think about thinking in the deepest sense, if we're going to try to model the world and, question everything on the way. That's kind of what philosophy does. It's beyond science in the sense that it's broader and it draws from a wide variety of fields. And it isn't tied to certainly the contemporary image of science, which is unfortunately often in the service of industry and, its capital demands and governments and their agendas and things like that. So that was why I wanted to think about networks in a broader sense and, build on the science, particularly the science of neural networks that I think are really revolutionary, not only in the way they have led to, the AI we see today, but also the study of the brain and things like that, but also society. It's all networks all the way down.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I think that Networkologies is sort of like when I read your book, it installed a new primitive in my brain for how to think about the world. And I think coming up in the late industrial age, I was sort of programmed more to think about hierarchies and corporate forms and things of that nature. But now that we have the internet and digital networks, and I've been learning about biological networks, it's been a really important mental model to build. So I would encourage listeners to check out that Green Pill episode we did together, and then also your book, Networkologies, which there's a link in the show notes for that.
Yeah, well, I mean, it grows from, it expands on and grows from the science of complex systems. And I think that that's worth saying as well, is that there is a science of networks. And the notion of emergence is crucial to this. And as time has gone on, as I've continued with this paradigm, the notion of emergence has come to the fore. It's how birds begin to flock. It's how schools of fish begin to school. It's self-organization. But it's not only self-enclosed. It's in relation to the environment. It's dynamic. It's multi-level. And if we look at how networks grow and develop and deepen in the natural world, I think there are paradigms that we can look at and learn from in ways that are different from the way capitalist networks grow, which are often much more like cancerous systems.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I think a couple key points there. Networks are an outgrowth of the idea set associated with complex systems. And then on the other end, I hear a question of networks for whom? Networks for capital, increasing capital, or networks for human thriving, or, I mean, networks for maybe some emergent outcome that's not specified or articulated in the way that we can put into words. But yeah, anything to respond to there?
Well, I mean, I think the notion of capital is an interesting one itself. What does it mean to have surplus? What does it mean to be able to invest surplus? In some sense, the sun is the original capital. It is, a surplus of energy. And if you get flooded by it, you'll get fried. If you don't have enough of it, you will die. And so it's finding that metastable, as they say in complex system science, middle path in a certain sense, almost in a Buddhist sense. A balance between too much and too little is where the thriving point is.
Yeah. What I want to respond to there is you saying the prompt, what is capital? And I think that this idea of basically capital being surplus is interesting to me. And a question that I feel like is on the tip of my tongue is, how do we build abundance networks? Basically, if the history of capitalism or the history of humanity is the history of surplus, and how do we distribute it? And we've had these hierarchies that sort of capture it and can effectively route it. What would an effective capital allocation network look like? And I guess that's the question that we're continuously asking on this podcast. What does post-tokenization, post-AI abundance networks look like? And it feels like there's something powerful there, but there's going to be probably 5 or 10 more years of explorations before we find niches that are doing billion-dollar abundance network type opportunities. So yeah, I mean, how would you build an abundance network knowing so much about networks?
Oh, that's a big set of questions. I mean, I think the idea of DAOs, right, of distributed autonomous organizations, being able to displace your legacy actors, the traditional systems of capture, the corporations that operate in a top-down manner that are not responsive to people and their needs. DAOs and on-chain networks allow for distributed democracy. And if governments or even distributed organizations dispense tokens that are distributed fairly, and then those could be applied to different rounds of capital allocation, you get a form of, granted quantified, but distributed democracy, at least within what is taken into the system. And then the question becomes, what are your parameters? How fair is access to the system? How fair is governance within the system? But the models that you're proposing, I think, have so many potentials for democratic governance that also is related not merely to politics but economics, right? And that juncture between them.
Mm-hmm. So I heard earlier in the episode you had sort of a critique of capitalism, and that being a system of capital producing more capital and almost like a cancerous ends. What do you think is the ideal system to be building in the 21st century for allocation of resources? And, what's the path from A to B, in your opinion?
I mean, I'm very inspired by the cooperative movements. These things came up in the height of the Industrial Revolution, and they were an attempt for people to just get by when they were starving. They were industrial factory workers, and they came up with stores for members. And a lot of the things that have mitigated the worst excesses of capital, from labor unions to social security to health insurance, were first pioneered by these sort of proto labor organizations before they were like institutionalized unions. And I have to say that in college, I lived in cooperative housing, and it was messy. It was disorganized, but it functioned. It kept costs down. We all worked in the house to keep things going. And it was completely democratically run, student-owned and operated. And the more I've looked into the history of the cooperative movement, I realized that there are actually large-scale cooperatives around the world, and even some powerful ones in the United States, like Ocean Spray, for example, the cranberry growers. They're a cooperative organization. They downplay this because anything called cooperative in the 30s and 50s was looked at as communism. But it is a profitable cooperative.
Yeah.
So I think there are alternate forms of social organization which, for various ideological reasons, haven't been pursued. And I think as technology scales up, there are.
How would you respond to the take that capitalism and communism and socialism are sort of like 20th century political ideologies, and we're moving to something more fundamentally different in the 21st century with blockchains and globalization and AI? Glenn Miles' political matrix is digital democracy versus synthetic technocracy versus corporate libertarianism. Like, is there a new triangle here, or do you think that we're still fundamentally in like a new form of those 20th century ideologies?
And you look at the right wing shift of techno libertarianism, and it really does look like a lot of the older reactionary ideologies under the surface, right? It's Milton Friedman, it's Hayek, all in New Guard. If you look at the sort of neoclassical economics that was coming out in the 1940s and 50s as a response to communism, but also Keynesianism. There's so much similarity. There's so much similarity between the contemporary libertarianism and the classical right-wing stuff. And this is where I think some of these terms are holdovers, but some of them take on new meanings. Who would have thought that we would be talking about neo-fascism in the 21st century? But here we are, looking at the contemporary government being like, what do we call this thing? Now, are terms like socialism still useful? I think so long as we don't think of it necessarily being tied to the older models, and unfortunately or fortunately, there's lots of resonances there, but as a person of the left, as someone who identifies as a socialist, yeah, I'm for making the world better for people rather than corporations and for groups of people. I see socialism as pretty basic. It's not a hard and fast set of ideologies. It's that we want to make life better for people, not for corporations, not for bank accounts.
So just to disambiguate for our crypto followers, which, as we know, crypto leans very libertarian. When we talk about socialism or communism in this podcast episode, it sounds like your definition is more bottoms up and small groups and peer-to-peer coordination. You're not advocating for state-level Stalinism, communism.
I mean, Stalin was not communism or socialism he certainly called himself this, but no, he was a ruthless top-down dictator. I'm looking for bottom-up democracy. And socialism is just the care aspect of that. So if people get triggered by those terms, socialism, it just means you shouldn't start off inheriting a ton of wealth that you didn't work for and, imbalancing the playing field where people get a, relatively fair start. It's fairness.
Right. Yeah, I think of myself as a technologist first and foremost, and I don't work backwards from any ideology, but I think it's useful to understand the different primitives out there. What are the money Legos? What are the things that people want to do with them? And then there's sort of like a combinatorial design space of how we're going to build abundance networks, hopefully more of in the 21st century. So I'm wondering if we can,
we got sidetracked a little bit from AI and networks. Yeah. Look, I think all of this is important, but I don't want to lose people who hear the word communism and socialism and just shut down,
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it was a useful detour for establishing. Christopher, I thank you for having this conversation with me, and I think it's going to add a lot of value to the builders that listen to it. So thank you
so much. Be well.
All right. We just heard from Dr. Christopher Vitale. I'm excited about Networkologies and his thoughts on AI because I think they're one of the most lucid, most sharpest ways of thinking about those domains that I've found. And so I hope that you enjoyed them as well. Thanks for listening to the Allo Capital podcast. Again, we featured the people who are building the capital allocation layer of the next internet. That means post AI, post tokenization, post stablecoins, post whatever is coming next. This podcast episode is for informative purposes only and is not financial advice. Do your own research. Do not make any financial decisions based off of these episodes. In addition, disclosure, I own crypto assets like ETH, DAI, USDC, and GTC. All right. Thanks for listening. See you on the next one. Bye-bye.